As I said, it's a special moment. It's a special day for us. It's a truly proud moment for Koç University. We're gathered here to honor a scientist who's not only a world-renowned economist, not only an exceptional scholar, but also someone we know very well, someone who represents the very best of what this university stands for. For me personally, this moment carries a deeper meaning. I had the chance to meet our medal recipient years ago, long before I joined Koç University, and he was a brilliant scientist even then. He was inquisitive. He had thought-provoking ideas that challenged the way we understood the world. I had the privilege of hosting him at C20, a part of G20 summit that took place in Turkey at the time, and he was on a panel alongside the Nobel laureate, Professor Daran Acemoğlu, who is also a medal recipient. So I remember that day really vividly, and what none of us could have known at the time, that I'd be standing here today, years later, and I would have the privilege to celebrate him as this year's medal recipient. So I just feel very emotional and very special today. With this joy and pride, I would now like to invite to the stage the person who will formally present today's speaker, today's medal recipient, and whose leadership continues to strengthen the scientific vision of our university, our president, Professor Dr. Metin Sitte.
Thank you, Hande, and hi everyone, dear students, our faculty and staff. It's a great pleasure for me to present our today's speaker. As Hande Hanım mentioned, we had a great evening yesterday with his presentation and his life story. I knew a little bit, but I saw more, and I saw his friends and his professors. But even I didn't tell in my speech, but even when I had recently in our rector house, the staff meetings, cocktails, one of the staff members from library came to me. We were just chatting about life. And he said, I know that our library is so nice and there are a lot of memories. And he said, that was a great memory of our great students like Ufuk coming to the library. I said, is this guy knowing that he will get the prize? Of course, he didn't know. But, it's amazing that Ufuk left a lot of memories to our staff also. Even the sports guys were saying how good he is in soccer. That's great to know. And also some of his classmates from that time, 2003 graduates, it looks like amazing class. A lot of great successful people came out of that class. So in that sense, our recipient this time is very special for us in many respects. First of all, of course, he is a great top scientist in his field in the world. He's rising star or the star in his field and in his generation. And also, he's our alumnus. For the first time, an alumnus from us is receiving this prize. And also, I have been working with him in our board of trustees since I joined, greatly discussing a lot of topics, including how we can do more activities in economic department here. Even this morning, we discussed a lot of great ideas. Since I'm also a researcher, I really enjoy discussing with highly motivated and hardworking researchers like him about a lot of great ideas. And you will see a lot of interactions and collaborations with him from now on, also more. So because don't forget, this prize is not only about recognizing our recipient's success, but also building a bridge between our university and Turkey and them. In that regard, with most of the recipients, we have had great interactions after they received this prize. They are part-time with us, or they are collaborating with us, or even co-advising students, and many different aspects we are working together. But again, Ufuk is really amazing. And, in our university, we believe that science is the really core power to transform our country and societies all the world. And seeing him as one of our graduates rising to the global prominence, leading the frontier of economic research and shaping intellectual agendas worldwide. Hearing his, maybe he will show some of them. A lot of great activities like Growth Institute and many other things are very exciting. And, we are trying to also have many top students like him to graduate from our university. And in our committee, really, we had many great discussions to select this year's recipient. And one of the topic of discussions was, of course, he was clearly very differentiated in his research. We discussed, like, he worked with a giant like Daron Acemoğlu. And one of the questions is he in the shadow of him, or is he really separated himself, an independent top researcher? And of course, the answer was clearly yes. He had the power and how to say, contribution novelty that he could differentiate himself from Daron, which is a very hard job. Sometimes having top students with you as a top professor, sometimes some of the students stay in the shadow of the professor, and which is very hard for them. Like if your parents are famous for any reason, it's harder for the kids to become separated and become famous themselves. But he managed to separate his research vision and contributions, and then become a star in his field, and not stay in the shadow of Daron. And also, his influence is so significant that in the Nobel Prize Committee's white paper for the 2025 Economics Prize, he was the fourth most cited scholar. The first three names on that list have already won the Nobel Prize. So that in itself speaks volumes about his standing in the field and puts high pressure on him for the future. Expectations are high. So again, we awarded him with a given committee, and our citation for his medal is for his pioneering contributions to the field of economics, particularly for his theoretical and empirical research on innovation, productivity, entrepreneurship, income distribution, and social mobility. And today we have the privilege of hearing directly from him about his groundbreaking work. So yesterday he had kind of more TEDx type of public talk, and today a little more scientific one. It was very exciting. The great thing about great talks is public learn a lot from his talk, which is really important. And there were a lot of praises after his presentation in that regard also. And also his, of course, story and many other things, as I mentioned. It was amazing. So his talk will be about new vision for economic growth when microdata rewrites the macro story. So in that sense, we are very excited to have him, and please join me in welcoming Professor Ufuk Akçiğit for today's presentation. Congratulations.
I'm extremely honored and humbled to be back home for this very special occasion. Coming back to campus, where I feel, very special, and always when I come back, I always feel home. And of course, most of the time I come back for academic reasons, but I cannot help myself just, remembering all the memories, that we accumulated. And Metin Hoca very kindly, in his remarks, he mentioned that, indeed, he was too generous, saying that I left a lot of marks on people on campus. But actually, from my perspective, it's the other way around. There are so many people, literally so many people at every corner of the campus who left marks on me. And that's why, when I walk around, it's not just, walking around. It's typically stopping by and saying hi to many, many people. And that's where I feel really home. So again, thank you so much for this great honor. Yesterday night, it was a amazing, magical night, really. It was a very special night, and everything just flew very, very naturally. Not much was planned in advance, but when you feel so welcome, then things start flowing. Indeed, I try to build an analogy between my life or academic journey and a bus ride or a plane ride. And indeed, the reason I built that analogy is also because I came from Amsterdam, the night before, and it was a very late flight. I was already very tired, and I just wanted to concentrate on my presentation. But then the person sitting next to me was so distracting. And it was a terrible flight because of him. He was constantly making noise and disturbing, etc. Then suddenly I realized how important it is, having a good neighbor in your ride. And then I thought about my journey and, my academic journey, and I felt extremely lucky to have always fantastic, wonderful people, many of whom are already also in the room today. And I was extremely lucky. I cannot explain it with anything else than luck. And I learned a lot from them. And now, the journey continues. So in that sense, I would like to share today with you some of our ongoing work, so that we can also discuss afterwards about these issues. And I have to also mention that the way I approach economic growth is that typically, there has been a lot of emphasis from an academic point of view for the role of innovation and productivity for economic growth. And this has been extremely well recognized. Indeed, I think 5 years ago, there was a Nobel Prize given for endogenous growth. This year, again, creative destruction, on the role of creative destruction on economic growth, again, the Nobel Prize goes to the field. And, the theoretical contributions have been extremely well recognized. What I try to do in my research with many, many wonderful students and colleagues, and I see Furkan sitting there, again, our own Furkan from Koç. So what we try to do, and I also see Yaren somewhere, Yaren and Mehmet, who are also helping us in our research. So what we try to do is we try to bring these models to real life. Real life is very, very complex, and real life is, it's impossible to understand, because there are so many interactions, so many individuals. Whenever somebody grabs a food from table, let's say, one orange, I cannot consume that orange anymore. It's not for me because it's gone. So even that interaction tells us that indeed, economic forces are just reinforcing each other, and we are using theory to operationalize empirical data. And I always like to think of ourselves as doctors. Economies are going through some problems, and as experts, we try to fix those problems. But an economy is like a human body with lots of organs, who are trying to, that are trying to operate simultaneously. And whenever we have a problem, there's a bruise, we have a headache, the doctor asks you for all the MRI scan and blood samples, blood tests, etc. I find an analogy. I see an analogy between the medical doctors and us when an economy has a problem because it's not growing enough, or maybe there are some financial crisis. In order to understand what leads to those outcomes, we have to look at the data. And by building this bridge between data, which is the real life, and the theory, which is our tools to fix those problems, is really challenging. And there, with the recent advances on computing, on microdata, etc., this is the agenda that we are trying to push. And I also not only try to bring those together with my collaborators, we also try to communicate these things to policymakers. And I will tell you also a little bit about that effort, which I feel very excited about. So let me go into the details. So this is going to be the title of my talk today. And so all this work that we conducted in recent years, we've been collecting this first, on the Economics of Creative Destruction book, which has been a fantastic collection. And recently it was also translated into Turkish, that has, really very important and informative chapters by amazing scholars, which I highly recommend. And we also, with the World Bank, the 2024 World Development Report was exactly on the middle income trap, a problem that many middle income economies are facing, including Turkey. And currently we are working on 2026 World Development Report, which is going to be on artificial intelligence and economic development. And I will also tell you a little bit about that towards the end of my talk. So let me first give you the big picture, basically. You might have seen this graph before, but I think it's really telling where the problem is emerging from. So when we look at the country's evolution over time, the best indicator is GDP per capita. Do we think GDP per capita is the perfect statistics to measure well-being in a country? No. But at least GDP per capita is something that we can measure relatively well. Otherwise, of course, happiness is something that matters. But measuring, what derives happiness, how to measure happiness is very, very challenging. Of course, there are other important elements like health. For instance, health-related indicators or education-related indicators are all contributing to our welfare, or inequality in a society also contributes to our overall welfare. But typically, it's much easier just to look at GDP per capita, because GDP per capita typically correlates well with many, many measures that we care about in the data. So, but looking at the just GDP per capita is not sufficient, because if you look at the primary school kids, and non-primary school kids eventually learn how to read and write, is this good news or bad news? When a kid, after starting to school, once they start learning how to read and write, is this student successful or not? Well, it depends. If the student learn how to read and write after 5 years, that's not a good news, right? But if the student learn how to read and write very quickly in the first couple of months, that's great news. So that's why we have to always measure things relative to the rest of the classmates, right? So that gives a better indicator in terms of, how good those economies are performing. So when we look at the countries, yes, almost all countries are growing, but some of them are growing really slowly and some of them are growing really fast. And that's why US typically sets a good benchmark, and relative to the US, we have to compare economies relative to the US so that we can understand if emerging economies are converging towards the US and they are performing relatively better, or if they are not doing their homework right. Korea, of course, is the success story. We discussed this earlier in more detail. Poland more recently and Chile have been good success stories. But there are 108 middle-income economies around the world, including Turkey. We can look at the average of the middle-income economies, and that's this solid black line. Relative to the US, starting from early 2000, there is some progress. But there is one important exception within this group, and it's China. And everybody talks about China, of course, in recent years, and we will also talk about China in the rest of the talk. But when we take China out, when we look at 107 remaining economies, their average GDP per capita relative to the US is not improving. So the main takeaway from this graph is that overall middle-income economies are not doing their homework. There are serious problems, but now we see a common symptom. Common symptom is that these economies are not growing overall. What is the problem? Now we have to look at the microdata and get into more details. So when we look at GDP per capita of the countries, so they are growing, and especially when they are very far from world technology frontier, they are growing faster. But once they reach 5 to 25% of the US GDP, which is about, with today's, dollar values, it's about between, $5,000 and $22,000 per capita income. When they reach that range, they start slowing down very, very visibly. Okay. And indeed, we can now ask an additional question. Economic growth comes from many different sources. People typically, whenever we listen to policymakers, they are like, oh, we are going to attract more financing, international financing will come. Yes, capital flows and capital formation is an important driver of economic growth. Labor is also an important driver of growth. But when you take certain amount of capital and certain amount of people and put them into different economies, they lead to completely different economic outcomes. And the reason is that there is an important difference in terms of efficiency. How people are using, or how economies are using their resources, differs in terms of how efficiently they are being used. And here you can see that, for instance, when you look at the physical capital and human capital relative to the US, middle-income economies have about 70% of the US capital and labor. 70%. How about GDP per capita, income per capita? Income per capita is only 20%. Even though income and GDP is produced using capital and labor ratio is 70%. Income should also be 70%, but it's not. Income is 20%. Where is this difference coming from? It's coming from exactly the way these resources are used. For instance, you can take resources and distribute them to the most effective users. And this is something that I've been repeating over and over again, and many people in this room will also agree with me. We know this also from academia, right? One strategy would be take all the resources, distribute it to all universities evenly without looking at the success of the universities. Or you can take the resources and distribute them based on the success and promise of the university. And that way, academic resources will be utilized better, and we all know this in the best possible way. Just like that, in an economy, if resources are just not distributed to the most deserving firms or individuals, then that economy will overall experience resource misallocation. Not allocation, but misallocation. And this is the common problem in these economies. And that's where the efficiency loss is coming from. Rather than distributing resources towards those most deserving, most promising people, if resources are distributed towards whoever is close to the government, let's say, or whoever shouts more, then the same amount of resources are used in the less effective way. So when we look at which economies are experiencing a slowdown much more rapidly, in the World Development Report, we took all the middle income economies and we divided them in terms of their liberties. In terms of civil liberties or economic freedom, the economic slowdown for middle-income economies starts to kick in much faster in less free societies, where the civil liberties or economic freedom is more limited. Those economies are bound to experience an economic slowdown. Why? Why is it happening? We typically, people like to give examples by looking at these more, powerful or more centralized governments or centralized economies and saying, look, when these countries are growing, they are typically having strong government that controls the resources. The theory doesn't hold. The theory holds. It's just that we need to understand that an economy goes through phases. An economy starting from having a very low income all the way to being a very high income, it goes through phases. And when an economy is really, really backward, typically they don't have the roads, they don't have the hospitals, they don't have even the bridges for transportation, even the basic infrastructure, internet infrastructure is very poor. Those economies, they don't have even the basics yet, right? So in those economies, you need to put the infrastructure right. Without having access to internet, how can we even communicate among ourselves, right? So infrastructure development or infrastructure investment is the way to go when the economy is really, really backward. But then, then we set the stage. Zemin futbol oynamaya müsait. Now we need to have good players to play on this turf, which is once the infrastructure is there, building more and more and more doesn't mean anything. From that point on, now we need to jumpstart entrepreneurship. We need to have people with ideas forming new firms, new businesses, because a limited group of people who are sitting in the capital cannot think about which companies will lead tomorrow's economy. It requires experimentation. Experimentation requires ideas. Ideas requires everybody's participation. Because if only 10 people are thinking about, where should we invest tomorrow, versus if there are, millions of people thinking about new ideas without differentiating between young and old, without differentiating between men and women, without differentiating between poor and rich, if everybody beyin bedava, you remember the video? So at the end of the day, everybody is thinking nonstop, but we need to let people to express their creativity. We need to give them opportunities, and that's more inclusive economies are generating more ideas, and then we need to reward the best ideas and let them rise up in the society. The social mobility in the society should be based on the quality of the ideas, not based on the quality of the connections. Okay, so that's why, when we come to this part here, now we start talking about something else. Centralized, powerful governments are great in building infrastructure. They control the resources. If they want to build roads, if they want to build bridges, they can build bridges. And that's something that we see repeatedly around the world. That's why for very, very, very poor countries, this phase, growth in this phase is relatively easy. And we saw this even in the Soviet Russia during communist times. After the Second World War, they built the infrastructure. Indeed, when you go to those economies, typically you have very clean roads or your infrastructure in general. But once they come to this 5 to 25% gap of the US, now you need to switch gears. You need to start growing through different activities. Especially, there has to be a balance between creation of new firms, preservation of new firms, and destruction of bad ideas or outdated ideas. And this is exactly where those economies start to fail. Normally, there has to be a balance between these three balloons, but instead, the preservation balloon gets inflated and the destruction balloon gets really squeezed. And this is something that everybody should appreciate. And this is true in every part of the society. Unless we make more space to new players, we cannot have new ideas. We cannot have fresh blood pumped into the economy or any system. Okay, so that's why it's extremely critical to appreciate the fact that we have to also know how to say goodbye to bad ideas. Even though we might like the person dearly, if the person is not productive, there has to be a fair competition. There has to be a fair competition in the society. So in the remaining part of my talk, I would like to tell you a little bit about what we are currently working on. And these are 5 different projects that, many of them are being also pushed forward with Furkan and our other team members. And let me first start by telling you a little bit more about the Growth Academy. Okay, so the topics will be first Growth Academy, then some interesting work on German economy, then I will talk about the electric vehicle industry, especially in China, then a small business index that we worked on, and artificial intelligence. So let me start telling you a little bit about the Growth Academy. In the very beginning of my talk, I tried to tell you that what we try to do in our research is first we try to take theory to real data or real life, but then it's, of course, as academics, the first instinct is to write the good academic papers, but then we need to also somehow communicate these to policymakers if we want policies to go in the right direction. So that's why we are spending some significant effort joint with the World Bank, and we initiated the so-called Growth Academy. And what we do there is, rather than having students, or we can also call them students, of course, but the participants in the Growth Academy are actual bureaucrats. They are ministers, vice ministers, chief economists of central bank. We bring them to Chicago, and so far there has been participation from 37 countries. And it's been 2 years, and it's been fantastic. I really don't want to call them students because they are also teaching the instructors. It's a fantastic dialogue, two-way dialogue, because they are coming from real life. They have the best expertise. They know the bottlenecks in the system. And also, academics also share their scientific findings, and it's been a great dialogue between the two sides. It's been so fruitful that even though initially we start the Growth Academy as an initiative to invite bureaucrats, now we are receiving invitations, And we've been so far to many countries, Indonesia, Egypt, Romania. And whenever we go, we try to discuss countries in the region. For instance, most recently when we went to Romania, we discussed the Ukrainian economy, Polish economy, and Romanian economy. And it's been very fruitful. And next month, we are going to Japan and India to have growth academies in those countries too. And this is just at the planning stage, but hopefully this, next year, hopefully we will also have something in Turkey, and so we'll definitely be in touch on the planning. So what do we do in the growth? What do we do in Growth Academy? In Growth Academy, we try to understand the economies. So yes, these middle-income countries, middle-income economies are struggling with lack of growth, but how should we approach this? Yes, the symptom is slow growth, but what is the cause? What causes the slow growth? Well, there, it's really important to understand how an economy is formed. The way I like to think about an economy is, first, there are new young generations born every period. And then these, it's a fact of life. There are heterogeneous talents in the society. The green heads here, let's say, are the most talented ones, less talented, and then least talented. That's for the sake of the argument. Let's just rank them like this. Then, depending on how the economy designed its education system, we send some of these kids, unfortunately, not all, but some of these kids to schools. It could be just like in Turkey, for instance, there can be a centralized university entrance exam. That's how we might rank people and send them. Sometimes, in some economies, people just apply to schools with recommendation letters and high school grades. That's how they are getting selected. Whatever the mechanism may be, we are sending some of these talents to these technical schools. The question is, do we generate some discrimination here? For instance, maybe if I grew up in a disadvantaged neighborhood, for instance, does it prevent my access to education, as a result, my qualification to these technical schools? Here I have also, universities in mind, master's programs, PhD programs. Whatever the system is, then unfortunately, not all the greenheads are going into the labor market or getting the training. We lose some of these talents along the way. Once they graduate from schools, once they graduate from universities, now they will join the labor market, but they have to decide, will I stay in the country or should I leave? Should I stay or should I go? So in that case, now the question is, what am I being offered? If I stay in the country, what am I being offered? If I go to a different country, what am I being offered? And that's exactly where the demand from industry comes into play. Depending on how the industry is shaped, if it's not a high-tech industry, if it's a low-tech economy in general, in that case, doing a PhD is a luxury because there's no demand. Whenever you apply to a job, the first thing you hear is you are all overqualified. I don't want to hire you. So that's why how an industry is shaped very much influences the demand for the talent. You can educate the best talents in the country. If there's no demand for them, all they will do is jump on a plane and then leave the country. So that's why when we want to understand an economy, we have to understand the supply side of talent, but we have to also understand the demand side of the talent. And that's why how competitive the industry is, how high-tech the industry is, and how you're generating dynamism in the economy is extremely important. That's why creative destruction, those three balloons that I showed, plays a very critical role. Unless we let best practices come into the economy, there won't be demand for the best talents. Okay, so that's why, this is how we approach economies. And by looking at the micro data, and typically what we do is we work with ministries or central banks. Why? Because they have typically the confidential micro data on individuals, on firms, on balance sheets, on test scores. Indeed, our Ministry of Education, for instance, have all our test scores, starting from middle school exam, high school exam, university entrance exam, they know normally the ranking of the talent in the country. And it's very easy. If we had access to those type of data sets, we can easily see how the talent is allocated in the economy, right? And with these countries that we are working with, we work directly with ministries and central banks. And that's why we try to understand if there's talent misallocation or if there's resource misallocation and how we can improve efficiency. Now, let me show you some of the findings that we generated from some recent work. As I mentioned, yes, there will be some innovative brains here, but there has to be also demand for them. There will be entrepreneurs who will demand the talent. So how will talent or inventors and entrepreneurs come together? Let's try to look at this, and we have conducted some really interesting work on this. So the hypothesis is that there has to be a symbiotic relationship between entrepreneurs who are thriving or who are very thirsty to scale up and the creative inventors. We asked a very simple question. By the way, some countries are really generous with their data. And in Denmark, we have very detailed information on all these individuals. And we asked a very simple question. What is the relationship between IQ and the likelihood of becoming an inventor? And when we look at this relationship, indeed, there are many people in the room who have patents and innovations. So what we see here is that there's a very tight positive relationship between IQ and the probability of being an inventor. Inventor is generating a new technology. Now, that's great news. That's the supply side. And it looks like, in Denmark, there has been a very good sorting of talents into these creative occupation of being inventor. What about entrepreneurs? What is the relationship between becoming an entrepreneur and IQ? When we look at this is the relationship. So normally it's very tempting to think of entrepreneurs as Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. They just, generate more and more technologies. And that's why you expect a positive relationship between the two as well, just because they are like inventors. That's how people tend to think about entrepreneurs. But actually, how many times did you meet some entrepreneurs who is like, Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg? But I guarantee that you meet repeatedly every day with entrepreneurs who are just running some mom and pop stores. When you buy your coffee, when you go to bakery, when you buy, your groceries, you repeatedly meet with an entrepreneur. And the majority of the entrepreneurs are running mom and pop stores. They are not running these high-tech, super growth companies. So that's why looking at this data is already telling you that not everybody is born to be the same in a society. Then the question is, why do we observe this negative relationship, and how can we differentiate between those growth-hungry entrepreneurs versus these so-called subsistence entrepreneurs? Let's ask an additional question. Let's run a regression. We, as economists, we like running regressions, and because the data is so rich that we can look at more covariates in the data. When you look at the inventors and what explains being an inventor, education is the top item. Eğitim şart. Okay, so education is number one, but then look at IQ. Even after controlling for education, ability plays a very critical role for being an inventor. When it comes to starting a new business, it's whether your parents are entrepreneurs or not that has the strongest bite. Once you control for parental entrepreneurial status, the second one is whether the parents are inventors or not. Once you control for these two, IQ and other things have no bite, education no bite. Okay, so this was initially a little bit of a puzzle, but once we start thinking about it, not suddenly everything start to make sense, because entrepreneurs are very different. Then, as a policymaker, how can you guide your resources towards more promising entrepreneurs so that they can create demand for these high-tech people? So we are going to do the following. Think about an entrepreneur who starts a new business. What do you think is the ambition of this person? Somebody starts a new business and you try to understand the future goal of this entrepreneur, what would you look at? I think one thing one can do is we can look at whom they're hiring to their company. Do they just hire blue-collar, unskilled people to carry the boxes around in the shop? Or paraya kıyıp, are they spending money and hire a technical person very early on to their company? And just this differentiation, just looking at this differentiation or just following this differentiation, we are going to classify entrepreneurs as those who have ambition to grow, transformative entrepreneurs, and those who are just working with blue-collar workers and probably they are subsistence. With this definition in data, 90% of the entrepreneurs are subsistence, only 10% are transformative. Let's look at the data again. What is the likelihood of between IQ and the likelihood of being a subsistence entrepreneur? It's very strongly negative. Why? Because 90% of the data was already like this. So this is not a surprise. I showed you this graph. What about being, the relationship between IQ and transformative entrepreneur for these 10%? Now it's very tightly positive. Okay. Suddenly you see that by simply looking at, tell me whom you're hiring to your firm, I can tell you where you want to go. Okay, so this is what the data tells us. Now, why is this important? This is important because the performance of the companies that are founded by subsistence versus transformative entrepreneurs are very different. Look at the life cycle or the growth trajectory of the firms. This dashed line is the life cycle profile of a firm that's founded by a subsistence entrepreneur who just hires blue-collar people. They are just growing a little bit in the beginning and they just flat like a pancake. They just remain flat like a pancake, okay? But those businesses that are formed by transformative entrepreneurs, they just keep growing. By the age of 10, they just keep growing. These are the people who are going to make a difference. These are the people who are going to create more jobs, high-paying jobs, quality jobs, etc. Indeed, once you start looking at the micro data, suddenly it makes perfect sense not to give the same type of subsidy to every entrepreneur. Because effectively, what is the common practice? The most common practice from a policymaker's point of view is just to give subsidies or tax breaks to whoever starts a new business. Because, there are also political reasons for why they might want to do that, but that's the typical practice. But this data already tells you that even though we give resources to some entrepreneurs, they don't have the ability or ambition to grow. Then what is the purpose? Why are we taxing the household? Effectively, what the government says is that, hey, I know your monthly salary. I'm going to each one of you. I'm going to tax 30%, 40% of your salary. I don't want you to consume it. Why? Because I'm going to take it and give it to some people who are starting new business. Whenever you subsidize a firm, those resources are not falling from the sky. I wish it was, but it's not. Those resources have to come from somewhere. It's coming from our pockets. Then every policy intervention has a cost on the society. It's not for free. There has to be a proper justification for why I'm taking from you and giving it to someone else. There has to be a proper justification. And that justification is, for instance, if there are spillovers related to the activities that we do. For instance, if you are working on research, and during your research, yes, you do produce a product and you sell it. But along the way, you train so many students. You produce a knowledge that future generations will also use. You do not internalize those. As a result, if you just look at your private market value of the product that you produce, it's just a subset of the social value that you generate through your research. As a result, basic science is the perfect example of that. I see Vargo Hocam is sitting back there. He's a mathematician and he writes academic papers. But, even though those Maxwell equations, Carter equations ultimately led to the invention of nylon and radio, the people who wrote those mathematical papers didn't receive a dime for those innovations. But they jump-started the whole process. Or everybody talks about AI these days, right? Oh, AI is great and Google is great and Nvidia is great. They are doing phenomenal transformative things. True, that's absolutely true. But AI was not invented by them. Yes, currently we are experiencing the AI spring or AI summer, and we are all enjoying the goodies of ChatGPT and other things, but it took us so much effort to come this far. Whenever you listen to a talk on AI, the presentation starts. I was in Ankara once, and even there, a presenter starts by saying, in 1950, Alan Turing, blah, blah, blah. True, Alan Turing can be quoted for that. This means that for 50, 60 years, there has been research on AI where people thought that this is not going anywhere. Neural network research, people thought that it's a dead end. But people still kept pushing. Why? Because the government funded it. Because universities pushed that research, right? Basic science pushed that research. DARPA, NIH, etc., funded all that research. As a result, we should not lose the sight on the actually what matters for the society. What matters for the society is first basic science. Universities are key. You cannot generate a quality growth in an economy without having strong, solid academic system that are acting independently, doing the research where the humans will ultimately benefit from. But sometimes we just overlook and think that, well, GDP is coming from whatever the firms are producing, so that's why firms are utmost importance. No, there's first the basic science that leads to what the firms are building on, right? So we should not lose this eyesight. So that's why looking at this data, we see so much heterogeneity in life. We need to guide our resources towards those that are generating spillovers. Those should be funded, right? The people who are generating spillover on the society, that should be funded. Now, if education is so critical for being a transformative entrepreneur and being an inventor, who gets educated, right? That's the important question. Now, this is the relationship between parental income and the child's likelihood of going to college. A massive positive relationship between the two. It's even painful to see, even in Denmark, where the education is free, at least tuition-wise. Here we see a massive positive relationship. Well, education is not, the cost of education is not only tuition, there are living expenses. There are also indirect costs, such as, if I'm born to a very poor family, my family is looking for me to provide for the family. So I cannot take 4 more years, 6 more years and do a PhD or whatever. I need to go and work immediately. So there are direct and indirect costs associated with going to school. So that's why, this positive relationship between the two shows that indeed financial frictions very likely play a critical role in the background. Now, what we do is we take these facts from microdata and then we build mathematical models like those growth models and we match them together and come up with policy recommendations. When we do counterfactual policy analysis, indeed, I mentioned like we are doctors, like medical doctors. When there's a new disease like COVID, for instance, what did people do? What did scientists do? They run experiments in labs, right? Until see which vaccine works. If economists are, as economists, we are pretending to be doctors of economists, how do we run experiments? Well, our experiments are run through mathematical models, through quantitative simulations. And that's exactly what we do. And when we run those policy simulations, this is the optimal policy. Say the government has very little resources to do policy intervention, okay? This government couldn't collect a lot of taxpayers' money. They have very limited resources. The question is, what should the government do with this money? Should it subsidize education? Should it subsidize innovative startups? Should it subsidize incumbent R&D spending, giving R&D tax credit, for instance, to firms? The model simulation says that, well, the bottleneck in this society is not every talent is getting the training that they deserve. The first thing is you need to strengthen the talent pool. Without having good players, your team cannot win the championship. With that analogy, it says, first, use all your resources to strengthen the talent pool. Only then, if you have more resources, now you can start thinking about splitting the money between starting education, subsidizing education, and also giving money to innovative startups, not all startups, but innovative creative startups. Rather than giving to every entrepreneur the same tax break, it says be selective. And then only then, if you have really abundance of resources, you collect a lot of taxpayers' money. In that case, now you can start thinking about subsidizing incumbent firms and give them tax breaks or additional subsidies. In reality, so there's a pecking order of policy interventions: education first, innovative startup second, incumbent subsidy third. In reality, it's completely the other way around. Why? You know why. I don't need to tell you, but unfortunately, in many economies, especially in middle-income economies, or also emerging economies, capture is a big problem. Incumbent capture is a big problem. When industry gets tangled up with the political system, then the policies that are implemented are not necessarily what's good for the society, but sometimes it's what's good for the special interest groups. So that's why I think it is extremely important to understand, how the resources are being distributed in an economy. And that's why the efficiency loss that I highlighted in the beginning becomes a very critical problem in these economies. Now, in Growth Academy, what we do is, as I highlighted, we work closely with participants, sometimes also with governments or sometimes with ministries, to understand what the problem is. And one of the interesting and important cases is the Ukrainian economy. Everybody talks about Ukrainian economy, of course, these days, and there's a war ongoing. And the question is, when the war is over, what should the Ukrainian economy do? Should it, there's a lot of discussion of saying that, well, Ukrainian economy should go back immediately what it was doing best right before the war. This is typically what people try to argue. But then the question is, was this a good economy, first of all? Before the war, was this a good economy? And when the war is over, should Ukraine immediately go back to what it was doing? In order to understand this, we have to go and look at the microdata and understand how the Ukrainian economy functioned. And we recently conducted the work with Furkan and two World Bank colleagues, and we looked at the microdata, tried to understand the Ukrainian economy over time. And what we found was very, very interesting, actually. This is the productivity growth in the Ukrainian economy year by year. In the very beginning, of course, they came out of the communist regime in 90s, and during 90s and early 2000, there was a very fast productivity gain, but gradually this productivity gain has been lost. And remember the life cycle that I showed, transformative and subsistence, etc. Let's ask a very similar question. How was the Ukrainian economies or Ukrainian firms' life cycle trajectories? We see three different episodes in the Ukrainian economy. First, this episode here, before 2008, there, Ukrainian economy was really dynamic. Look at the red bar here, the red line. The Ukrainian economies were growing up or out. Good firms were growing, bad firms were being eliminated. But then, after 2008, between 2008 and 2013, there's a visible productivity slowdown. And you look at the firm's life cycle, this is very similar to US firms' life cycle. This here looks very much like the Mexican firms. Mexican firms are, in general, it's shallow. It's, they are not growing as rapidly. After 2013, after 2014, they look just like the Indian firms, where, in India, it's very well known in the literature that there's not much sign of growth of Indian firms. So you see that Ukrainian economy gradually lost steam over time, and this is where it used to be right before the war. Is this the economy that the Ukrainian economy should go back to? Clearly not. So this means that in economics, we like to call it, you should not waste a crisis to make a reform. And this is exactly what this study also says. Basically, if, there's one opportunity to make big reforms, this is the time for Ukrainian economy. Rather than going back, it can, with the right policies, it can set its future into the right trajectory. Of course, there are many other things in the background, but I just wanted to give a quick glance. So let me just spend just a few minutes and then wrap up. Another line of work that we do is looking at the German economy. In Germany, we have done very extensive work because German economy is also very interesting. This is coming from today's Germany, basically. These are the heat maps of GDP per capita and innovation per capita at the regional level in Germany. And when we look at these graphs very carefully, indeed you can draw the borders here quite visibly. Indeed, this is even more visible. You see the East Germany versus West Germany even today. It's been more than 30 years. German government broke records in terms of subsidizing those firms in East. Still, the productivity gap is more than 20%. What happened? Well, of course, there are historical roots, and the German government, thankfully, they opened their archives to us. And what we do is we have a fantastic team in Germany that we are collaborating with. And this picture was taken 2 weeks ago from a GDR museum. It's a fantastic museum if you ever go to Leipzig. It's really mind-blowing, actually. It has items both from the communist regimes and also during the transition. And here you see Gorbachev, and here you see Ronald Reagan. And so what we did is, we had access to all their archive data. And by saying these are the archive documents here, we digitize all the archives to see how the privatization or the transition took place in early 90s. Because when you want to understand East and West Germany, you need to go back to where it's initially started. When the Berlin Wall, this is the piece of the Berlin Wall here, when the Berlin Wall came down, the first thing that happened is that there were 15,000 state-owned enterprises that were insanely inefficient. They were so outdated, their technologies, that it was not usable. Of course, there were exceptions, but in general, there were lots of inefficient firms. What did the German government do? The German government established a privatization agency, Treuhand. And this person here is sitting here is Detlev Rohwedder, which is the head of the privatization agency. And they started privatizing starting from 1990. Unemployment rate was 0 during communist times. Just in 1 year, unemployment rate went up to 15 to 20%. And people start demonstrating on the street. People were very, very unhappy. And Helmut Kohl, who is here, promised very rosy days to East German workers. Clearly, that wasn't the case. And then what happened is that on April 1st, 1991, Detlev Rohwedder, who was the head of the privatization agency, gets assassinated and he dies. Of course, there's a big chaos, there's a big panic. What happened from that point on? Well, people start worrying, especially the privatization agency starts worrying big time. And you can see this when you look at the data, you can see in the data very visibly how they panicked. They could privatize these firms in 2 ways. First, you can just do due diligence and say, well, this company is worth this much money. That's how we are going to sell this company. And you can find the best buyer. The buyer can buy this company and then optimally fire some workers or maybe, bring some new technologies and sets its own business, basically. And this is cash-based contract, cash-based sell. Alternatively, the government can say, hey, I don't care about the money that you're going to pay, but whenever you buy this company, I force you to hire 10,000 workers or 5,000 workers, which means that the German government, out of panic, was forcing those inefficient firms to get inflated even more. But this is exactly the creation, preservation, and destruction bubble. It goes in the opposite direction. Because normally, healthy economy should be able to say goodbye to inefficient firms. This was going exactly in the opposite direction. So what happened? Of course, that's first the panic contracts, panic privatization. You can see it here. The second panic happened as follows. I'm talking about 15,000. Can you imagine 15,000 firms will get privatized? How many agents did the privatization agency have at the time to privatize 15,000 firms? 200. 200 agents were in charge of privatizing 15,000 companies. It was mission impossible. So what did the German government do? They sit down, they wrote letters to West German company owners asking for help. They said, send us your managers so that they can help us do the privatization. Effectively, kurda kuzuyu teslim etmişler basically. That's exactly what happened. So then what happened is that all these companies sent their top managers to run the privatization. The beautiful thing is in the data, we can see even the names of the managers who came, for instance, from Bayer, the company Bayer. These managers were sent to privatization agents, and we are able to see who was in charge of which company's privatization and what were the conditions of that contract, what was the price, etc. And then we can also see the careers of these people 10 years later, 20 years later. You know, if you're worried about revolving doors, for instance, this is the perfect setting to check that. And then, of course, we see very interesting results. For instance, you know, effectively, in the data, repeatedly, what we see is that those companies that were very powerful and, you know, that had a very strong market share in the West, whenever their manager was in charge of privatization, typically on the East, the good potential rivals get liquidated. They disappeared. You know, there are quite a few examples, like, for instance, Lufthansa, of course, it's the monopolist. And there was a potential rival coming from East Germany, which was Interflug. Interflug, Lufthansa drags on. First they say, oh, we are going to buy a share of it. And then, no, we are not going to buy it, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, Interflug gets liquidated. And as a result, Lufthansa is now the monopolist still. And, you know, there are many, many similar examples, you know, BMW versus Trabant, and, you know, so many mistakes were done. First, you know, again, conflict of interest was definitely a key issue. Another important problem was that all these, you know, inefficient firms were artificially inflated. As a result, you see this productivity loss that I mentioned, and then we still observe this heat map. And now we are first documenting these things and how these things had long-term effect on German economy, and we also try to come up with policy recommendations to undo these difficulties. A very quick thing, another interesting project we are currently working on is the EV industry, electric vehicles. Of course, everybody talks about electric cars these days. China is definitely leading this. And of course, China wasn't an electric car producer in the beginning. At best, they were producing batteries. BYD was a battery producer for German cars. But of course, they learned how to make it. And indeed, you know, in this work that we do with the great Chinese colleagues, we study all the policies that the Chinese government implemented. And what we see is that we called it the 3C model that the Chinese government followed. First, they implemented all the policies to build capability in the country. First, they said, look, we don't know how to produce these electric cars. We need to build a capability first. How did they do it? First, lots of grants to public labs, research labs, R&D expenditure to state-owned enterprises to develop the technology, and also giving R&D subsidies to build capability. And they learned also a lot from the German manufacturers, and that's how they passed the first stage. Once they start producing some prototypes or some initial cars, now there has to be a demand for them. But who's going to ride an electric car that nobody has used before? They needed to break the mental barrier, and they turned the school buses to electric cars first. And by putting simply your child, your most precious thing on an electric car, suddenly, you know, people start to look more favorably to these cars. And then in addition, you know, there has been aggressive purchase subsidies and building the charging stations, etc. There has been a push for consumption. The second C came into play. Only when the market was ready, then they open up the market for international competition. And then, for instance, Tesla came in 2020. So these are the 3 C's, and we are trying to understand the role of these policy sequencing. And that's why, you know, normally whatever you can learn from the electric industry, you can also map this to other industry development too. And I think we have also a lot to learn from this experience, basically. And, you know, when you look at the technologies that were produced initially, majority of the majority of the patents were being produced by public entities initially, but gradually the private entities started to take over. So state was an enabler. State was not crowding out private investment. State was setting up the game, and then they enabled private investment and get out of the way. And that's how, the Chinese economy managed to be an important player. This, I want to go very fast. So small businesses are very, very critical. Even in the US, 80% of businesses have less than 9 workers, but there's very little monitoring of small businesses. In Turkey, small businesses are even a larger share of the economy. But how much do we know about the health of the small businesses in Turkey or in any economy, even in the US? Not much. But the recent AI revolution or recent digital revolution allows us to generate new data sources. And one data source that we use is the online accounting softwares. Many individuals and entrepreneurs are using online accounting software, which means that now there is real-time data flowing into those accounting platforms. If there is collaboration, maybe, when we think about, the Turkish case, for instance, kariyer.com, etc., they know all the applications in real time. So these are providing great new data opportunities, and we are using them to this is like an EKG. So this is just like, the heart rate of an economy, and this is the heart rate of small business employment in the US. We also, given that it's an accounting software, we can see their expenses. What we observed most recently is that they are using disproportionately more their own personal credit cards to finance their business, which is a terrible way of financing any business, because when you carry balance, good luck. And this difference here shows that indeed they weren't able to pay back anymore, and they start to accumulate more and more debt. And so the final thing I would like to highlight is the upcoming, our work on artificial intelligence. And this part especially is related to academia. So that's why, I would like to show you a very interesting fact on how AI is affecting academic research, or at least academic life. So this is a graph that looks at salaries of scientists who are publishing in AI-related fields. These are all publishing people, okay? And we looked at those scientists who are working at universities and those people who are working in industry. Of course, just like in any other field, AI is also a superstar, profession. So that's why probably it's more informative to look at the top 1% of the salary distribution. Top 1% academics working in universities in AI-related fields were making $300,000 in 2000. After 20 years, their salary has increased to 390. Okay, some increase, visible increase. Indeed, when you look at the average salaries didn't change much. But the top 1%, you see some visible increase. When we look at industry, similar people, again, AI publishing people, they are publishing academic papers. They were making around $590,000 in the beginning. When this visual revolution took place on AI, the game changed drastically and the salary just skyrocketed. The salary went up to 2 million basically. Okay, and look at this gap now. Look at this gap and look at this gap. Now, of course, when the industry compensation goes up so fast, it becomes much harder to stay in academia. Of course, everybody wants to first contribute to the intellectual environment, but everything has a price, right? Everything has a price, and eventually this gap is so large that there's now an out-migration from academia to industry. And when we look at, especially by age, who is leaving, it's not so much the seniors that are leaving. It's the junior scientists that are leaving academia. Look at this, junior scientists are leaving academia. And when we look at what industry or what companies they are typically going to information companies, like, Facebook, Google, etc. And whether they are going into startups or incumbent companies, after 2017, which is attention is all you need, and that's why we changed the title of our paper, Attention, and in parentheses, Money is all you need. After 2017, they start to go disproportionately more to incumbent firms. So the market giants that we typically see on TV and also policy meetings, now they're on the receiving side. And I think this is an important message for how we should discuss the role of universities in the age of AI, especially the funding model of universities. How will we make sure that universities will remain competitive? And of course, they can never be competitive with industry, but at least, it shouldn't, universities should not fall back in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of the resources that it provides. Even in the US, now the game is changing so much. Now, if we map all these things to developing countries, including Turkey, I think we have to have a very frank conversation in terms of how we are going to maintain a healthy research environment in our universities. And infrastructure demand is also very significant. And this is something that, I think is a very pressing issue. So this is my last slide. Of course, we are doing all this work, but, all this work is thanks to, fantastic brains, and, 3 of them are already in this room. And, it's been a very fun journey so far, but it's all thanks to, again, these amazing students. And we are very, very, very much looking forward to expanding our collaboration and leading this research all together. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening.